I was actually sitting at my desk this morning, and I was just looking at my hand.
Just admiring it?
Well, sort of. I was opening and closing it, watching the tendons move under the skin on the back of my hand. And it really struck me just how much we take all of this machinery for granted.
Oh, absolutely. We definitely do.
I mean, we treat our arms like these simple automatic tools. If you want a cup of coffee, you just reach out and grab it. If you want to type an email, your fingers they just know exactly where to go.
It feels completely seamless. That is really the magic of
No,
it.
it feels automatic.
Yeah.
But we have this massive stack of medical literature and anatomy guides right in front of us today, and it paints a totally different picture.
A much more complicated one.
Exactly. When you actually strip away the skin and look at the engineering underneath, the upper limb isn't just a simple tool. It is this chaotic, terrifyingly complex system of levers, pulleys, struts, and really high voltage wiring.
It really is engineering at its most ambitious.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's most precarious.
Yeah, precarious is the perfect word. And that is the exact angle we are taking for this deep dive today. We're looking at a comprehensive medical study guide, which is simply titled Upper Limb.
A very unassuming title for such a dense topic.
Very unassuming. But our mission today isn't just to sit here and memorize the Latin names of a bunch of bones. We are going to look at the engineering trade-offs.
Right, the compromises.
Exactly, because the source material makes one thing very, very clear. To get the incredible versatility of a human arm, to be able to throw a fastball at 90 miles an hour or thread a tiny needle, we had to accept some serious design flaws.
Yeah, flaws is maybe a harsh word, but it's completely accurate in an engineering sense. It's a series of evolutionary compromises. The upper limb is built for reach and for manipulation. It is not built for stability.
Unlike the leg, for instance.
Exactly. The leg is built to carry weight, to be stable. The arm is built to move. And because of that mobility, when it fails, when it breaks, or when it dislocates, it does so in very specific, incredibly predictable patterns.
It's like the anatomy actually dictates the injury.
It really does.
So here's the plan for you listening today. We are going to trace the kinetic chain of the arm. We'll start right at the anchor point near your neck. We'll travel down the arm, through the elbow, and we'll end up in the fine motor complexity of your fingers.
It's a fascinating journey.
It really is. We are going to decode exactly how you were built by looking at exactly how you break.
Which, ironically, is often the very best way to understand how a machine works in the first place.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't realize how important a strut is until the moment it snaps.
That is so true. So let's start at the very top. The pectoral girdle, which it sounds really sturdy, right? Like a thick suit of armor. But it's actually anchored by a single, relatively slender bone, the clavicle.
The collarbone, or mechanically speaking, the strut.
The strut, is that actually the technical anatomical term?
Functionally, yeah, it is. If you look at the mechanics of the skeleton, the clavicle is the only horizontal long bone in your entire body.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
The only one?
The only one.
Yeah.
Its primary job is to act as a rigid beam. It pushes the shoulder joint away from the chest. It basically transmits the entire weight of the arm over to the axial skeleton, specifically over to the sternum.
So if we didn't have that strut, our shoulders would just, slump forward onto our chests?
Basically, yes. You would have practically no leverage. You would look very narrow physically, and your range of motion would be terrible.
That makes sense.
And because it's doing this heavy lifting from literally day one, the source material points out something really fascinating about how it develops. It is the very first bone in the human body to start ossifying.
Wait, really? Before the skull or the spine?
For everything. At about 5 or 6 weeks in the womb, it starts turning into bone. And it does it differently than other long bones, too.
How so?
Well, usually a bone starts as a cartilage model, like a soft blueprint, and then it slowly hardens over time. But the clavicle skips that step entirely. It undergoes what is called membranous ossification.
Membranous ossification.
Right. It essentially solidifies directly from the connective tissue. No cartilage model required.
It's in a real rush to get to work.
It is. But that early rigidity comes at a significant cost. The guide lists the clavicle as the most commonly fractured long bone in the human body.
I believe it.
And the mechanism for the fracture is almost always exactly the same. They call it FUSH.
Push. I love that acronym, fall on outstretched hand. It is just the ultimate classic human reaction.
It really is. You trip over something, and instinct immediately takes over.
Yeah.
You throw your hand out to catch yourself.
You don't even think about it.
Exactly. But think about the physics of that for a second. That kinetic energy hits your hand, it travels straight up your wrist, shoots through the forearm bones, bypasses the elbow, goes straight up the humerus, and then slams into the shoulder.
And the clavicle is just sitting there, taking the hit.
It's the end of the line. It's the strut, holding everything back against the chest. So when the kinetic force is too great, the strut just snaps.
And it doesn't just snap randomly anywhere, right? The anatomy creates a very specific weak point.
It does. The clavicle isn't just a straight stick. It has a distinct S shape. It curves outward, and then it curves backward. The junction between the medial 2/3, the part closer to your chest, and the lateral 1/3 is the weakest link.
Because that's where the curvature changes.
Exactly. It's a structural bottleneck.
Now, this was the part of the reading that genuinely gave me a visceral reaction. When that collarbone snaps, the pieces don't just, stay neatly put. They react to the muscles pulling on them in this really grotesque way.
It turns into a massive tug-of-war. The outer piece, the lateral fragment that is attached to your arm, suddenly has absolutely nothing holding it up anymore.
So gravity just takes it.
Gravity takes over, and the heavy pectoral muscles pull it inward and down. Your entire shoulder literally drops.
But the inner piece, the part that's still attached to your neck.
That part has the exact opposite problem. There is a very powerful muscle in your neck called the sternocleidomastoid.
That's the one you can feel popping out if you turn your head sharply, right?
That's the one. Now, normally the weight of the arm counters the pull of that muscle. But without the arm acting as a counterweight, that neck muscle just rips the inner bone fragment aggressively upward. So you get this incredibly distinct stair-step deformity under the skin. One broken end is yanked down, and the other end is yanked up.
That is just a terribly vivid image. It is amazing how your own muscles basically become the enemy the second the bone structure fails.
They do what they're programmed to do, regardless of the broken bone.
Right. Okay, so we have the strut in the front. Let's look at the back of the girdle now. The scapula or the shoulder blade?
Now, this is a completely different beast structurally. If the clavicle is a rigid strut, the scapula is a floating plate. It's a flat, triangular bone that sits on the back of the rib cage between the 2nd and 7th ribs. But here's a real kicker. It doesn't actually articulate with the spine.
It just floats there.
It is effectively floating on a thick sea of muscle.
Which means its position is entirely dependent on those muscles working correctly. If the muscular wiring fails, the bone just goes rogue.
Precisely. It relies 100% on dynamic stability. And the classic clinical example of this failing is a condition called winging of the scapula.
Winging of the scapula. It sounds quite poetic, honestly, like you're about to sprout wings and take flight. But the description in the source material is anything but poetic.
No, it's a functional disaster for the patient. There is a specific muscle called the serratus anterior. Its main job is to literally glue the inner border of your shoulder blade flat against your ribs.
It anchors the platform so your arm has leverage to push and lift.
Exactly. And this essential muscle is powered by a very specific nerve called the long thoracic nerve.
Okay, so what happens if that nerve gets damaged?
Well, say you take a hard blow to the ribs, or even if you're carrying a really heavy backpack with the straps digging deeply into your shoulder. If you damage that nerve, the muscle develops a palsy. It basically goes totally offline.
It just stops firing.
Right. So when you try to push your hands against a wall, the scapula isn't being held down against the ribs anymore. The inner edge just violently pops backward off the rib cage.
Like a bird's wing opening up.
Just like a wing, hence the name. And the structural result is that suddenly you cannot raise your arm above 90 degrees.
Because the base of support is just gone.
Exactly. The platform has collapsed. It really goes to show you how fragile the system is. One single nerve gets pinched, and the entire mechanical linkage of the shoulder completely fails.
Speaking of mechanical linkages, let's move to the main event, the shoulder joint itself, the classic ball and socket.
Or, as I prefer to call it, the golf ball sitting on a tee.
Yes. The ratio mentioned in the text is just wild. The head of the humerus, the ball, is literally 4 times larger than the glenoid fossa, which is the socket.
4 times larger.
Yeah.
And that is the primary engineering trade-off we talked about in the intro. Evolution decided that, for humans, reach is far more important than stability.
We needed to throw spears, climb trees, reach behind our backs.
Exactly. To do all of that, you absolutely need a shallow socket. If we had a deep, highly stable socket like the hip joint, for example, you would move like a stiff robot. You wouldn't even be able to reach up and brush your own hair.
But the terrible cost of that mobility is that it dislocates easier than any other joint in the human body.
By far. And it almost always dislocates in one specific direction, anteroinferiorly, which means down and to the front.
Why that direction specifically? Why doesn't it pop out the back?
Because if you look at the architecture of the shoulder, it is heavily armored on top by bone. It's strongly protected at the back by the thick rotator cuff muscles. But underneath, inferiorly,
There's nothing there.
almost nothing, just a loose, redundant joint capsule. It is simply the path of least physical resistance.
And the guide mentions there is a specific body position that basically invites this disaster, like a don't do this pose.
Yeah, the vulnerable position is abduction and lateral rotation. Think of a football quarterback winding up to throw a deep pass, or a volleyball player pulling their arm way back to spike the ball.
The arm is up high and levered backward.
Right. In that position, the large head of the humerus is pushing directly against that extremely weak bottom edge of the socket. Just a little bit of extra force from a tackle or a block, and pop, it's completely out of the socket.
Oh man, it sounds painful just describing it. Okay, moving down the line. We are leaving the shoulder and traveling down the humerus, the main upper arm bone.
The longest bone in the upper limb.
Now, I really loved how the study guide treated the humerus. It didn't just describe the physical shape of the bone, it treated the humerus like a literal map for nerve damage.
It really is a map of consequences.
It's like a twisted anatomical game of Clue. You tell me exactly where you broke your arm, and I will tell you exactly which hand function you just permanently lost.
That is a brilliant way to put it. The nerves in the arm don't just float freely in safe, padded spaces. They spiral directly against the hard bone in very specific, tight grooves.
So they are physically vulnerable because they are so intimately close to the rigid structure.
Exactly. So let's run the checkpoints on this highway. Starting at the top, just below the ball joint. This area is called the surgical neck.
Because it requires surgery so often.
Basically, yes. If you fracture the surgical neck of the humerus, you are immediately endangering the axillary nerve. That nerve wraps right around the surgical neck.
And what happens if you sever it?
If you sever the axillary nerve, you lose sensation over the contour of the shoulder, the area they call the regimental badge patch. But more importantly, the deltoid muscle gets paralyzed.
Meaning you can't lift your arm sideways away from your body anymore. Okay, let's move further down to the middle of the bone shaft.
Now, this is a very famous one clinically. The radial nerve runs in what's called a spiral groove, right along the back of the humerus, right in the mid-shaft. And it sits directly on the bare bone.
So a break right there just scissors the nerve against the jagged bone edges.
Very often, yes. And the radial nerve is primarily responsible for extension. It's what allows you to lift your wrists and your fingers up.
So if that nerve gets knocked out,
You get a classic condition called wrist drop. You lift your arm up, and your hand just hangs completely limp like a wet towel. You absolutely cannot cock your wrist back to grip anything.
which essentially makes the entire hand useless, even if the bones and muscles in the hand itself are perfectly fine.
Exactly. You physically need a stable, extended wrist to generate any real grip strength. Try gripping something hard while your wrist is bent forward. You just can't do it.
Continuing south down the arm, we hit the inside of the elbow, the infamous funny bone area.
Anatomically known as the medial epicondyle, the ulnar nerve runs right behind it. We've all bumped this on a table edge and felt that horrible electric tingling shooting down into the pinky finger.
But an actual bone fracture here is much worse than a bump.
Much worse. A fracture here can cause severe permanent damage to the intrinsic small muscles of the hand. The tiny muscles that allow you to spread your fingers apart or make really fine coordinated movements.
And finally, the very bottom of the humerus, right above the actual elbow joint, the supracondylar fracture.
This one is the absolute nightmare scenario, specifically in young children. The bone of the humerus is very, very thin right there. It's almost completely flat.
And a fracture here puts some major structures at risk.
It risks the median nerve, sure, but even more critically, the jagged bone risks slicing or kinking the brachial artery.
Which is the main blood supply to the entire lower arm.
Correct. And the source material highlights a devastating complication called Volkmann's ischemic contracture. It is something every single emergency room doctor is absolutely terrified of because it happens so fast.
It reads like a medical horror story. Walk us through the exact mechanism of how this happens.
So imagine a kid falls off the monkey bars. They break the humerus right above the elbow. The sharp, displaced edge of the bone kinks or partially tears that brachial artery.
So the blood flow to the forearm just stops.
Right. This lack of blood is called ischemia. Suddenly, the muscles in the forearm are completely starving for oxygen.
And if they starve for too long?
The muscle tissue simply dies. But it doesn't just rot away and disappear. The body tries to heal it by replacing the dead muscle with thick, fibrous scar tissue.
And here is the really sinister thing about scar tissue. It shrinks.
It contracts heavily. So as the child's forearm technically heals, this massive scarring pulls all the flexor tendons irreversibly tight.
It pulls the wrist inward into severe flexion, right?
Yes, and it curls the fingers tightly into a rigid claw. The hand essentially becomes a frozen, useless hook.
That is just terrifying.
It really is. That is why if a kid comes in with a badly broken elbow, the very first thing the doctor checks isn't the x-ray to see the bone alignment. It's the wrist to check for a strong pulse.
That is incredibly high stakes. It really emphasizes that the arm is one continuous kinetic chain. You break a bone in the elbow and you can completely destroy the hand.
It's all deeply connected. You cannot isolate the individual parts.
So let's look at the elbow joint itself now, because there is some really neat geometry here that doctors use to figure out what is wrong, sometimes without even taking an x-ray first.
Ah, the elbow triangle. It is a brilliant bit of old-school bedside diagnostics.
How does it work?
Well, you have 3 distinct bony bumps you can easily feel on your own elbow right now. The olecranon, which is the sharp tip of your elbow, and the 2 epicondyles on the inner and outer sides.
Okay, I feel them.
Now, when your arm is bent at a perfect 90-degree angle, those 3 points form a perfect equilateral triangle.
And when you straighten the arm all the way out?
Those same 3 points align perfectly into a straight horizontal line.
Okay, so how does that help diagnose an injury?
If a patient comes into the ER and that triangle is visually distorted, maybe it's scaling or flattened out on one side, you know instantly that the bones of the joint have dislocated relative to each other.
But what if the triangle is perfectly shaped, yet the arm is clearly broken and swollen?
Then you know the joint itself is intact and the break has to be above the joint line, like that supracondylar fracture we just talked about.
Geometry literally saves the day. It tells you exactly where to look. Let's keep moving down into the forearm. We have the dynamic duo of bones here, the radius and the ulna.
Right, the radius is the bone on the thumb side. An easy way to remember it is thinking of the word rad, or visualizing the thumb as a radio antenna.
And the ulna is the longer stabilizer bone on the pinky side. Now, there is a very specific injury mentioned here for toddlers called nursemaid's elbow.
Extremely common.
I've actually seen this happen at a playground. A parent is swinging their kid around by the arms, playing airplane, and suddenly the kid is just screaming, their arm is hanging limp, and they refuse to use it.
It's terrifying for the parents, but it's usually just a mechanical slip. The head of the radius bone is held tightly against the ulna by a little ring-shaped ligament called the annular ligament.
So what goes wrong?
Well, in adults, the head of the radius bone is shaped kind of like a wide mushroom, so it can't physically slip out of that ring. But in young kids, the bone hasn't fully flared out yet. It's more cylindrical.
It's slippery.
Exactly. So a sudden, sharp vertical pull, like swinging them by the hands, slides the head of the bone right out of that ligament ring, and the ligament gets trapped inside the joint.
It sounds painful, but the fix is surprisingly simple, right?
It really is. A doctor just supinates the hand, turns the palm up, and flexes the elbow quickly, and you'll actually hear and feel a little click. It pops right back in, and the kid is usually fine 5 minutes later.
That's amazing. Let's slide further down to the wrist now. We are back to the classic fall on outstretched hand scenario again. But the text distinguishes between 2 very specific, named fractures based entirely on how you happen to land. Colles and Smith's fractures.
This is all about the specific angle of impact. The Colles fracture is the absolute most common wrist fracture. This happens when you fall forward and you land hard with your palms down.
Your classic trip and fall.
Right. The radius bone breaks about an inch from the wrist joint, and the broken fragment is violently shoved backward or dorsally.
And the text gives this a really specific visual name, the dinner fork deformity.
It's a classic medical description. If you look at the patient's swollen wrist from the side profile, the hump of the broken bone perfectly resembles the curve of a dinner fork resting on a table.
And what about the Smith's fracture?
That is the exact reverse mechanism. It usually happens if you happen to fall on the back of your hand. Maybe your hands were full, holding a box, or you slipped and fell backward.
So the bone shifts the other way.
Yes, the bone fragment shifts forward. in toward the palm. And structurally, this one is sometimes referred to as a garden spade deformity.
Garden spades and dinner forks, anatomists really seem to love their household object analogies.
Hey, it works. It helps you instantly remember the shape of the injury when you are staring at a swollen, bruised wrist at 2 in the morning in the emergency room.
Good point. Oh, before we leave the forearm, the text briefly mentions Galeazzi and Monteggia fractures.
Ah, yes. These are named fractures where one bone breaks, but the force is so great that it actually dislocates the opposing bone at the joint. It just shows how tightly coupled the radius and ulna are.
Yeah.
You rarely destroy one without affecting the other.
Okay, we have finally arrived at the final destination, the hand. And if the shoulder joint was all about raw sweeping leverage, the hand is all about intricate, compact, high-density complexity.
It really is a biological masterpiece. You have 8 individual carpal bones clustered just in the base of the wrist, arranged tightly in 2 rows.
But we really need to focus on one specific troublemaker in that cluster, the scaphoid bone.
Yes, the scaphoid.
This is the little bone you can actually feel at the base of your thumb if you stretch your thumb back. It sits right in that little skin depression anatomists call the anatomical snuff box.
Which is a very charming old-world name for what is essentially a massive danger zone. The scaphoid is the crucial mechanical link between the 2 rows of those wrist bones. It takes a ton of physical force whenever you fall.
But it has a massive evolutionary design flaw. The text says its blood supply is retrograde.
Retrograde.
Explain that. That literally means backward, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
In the vast majority of bones, blood vessels enter from multiple points along the shaft, or right into the center. But in the scaphoid, the main blood vessel enters at the distal end, the end that is closer to your fingers, and the blood has to flow backward through the bone toward your arm.
I instantly see the problem here. If you break the bone right in the middle at the waist of the scaphoid,
You completely sever the supply line. The bottom half of the bone, the proximal fragment near the arm, is now totally isolated. It's cut off from its only blood source.
so it starves.
It starves and it dies.
Yeah.
The medical term is a vascular necrosis.
And dead bone doesn't just heal itself over time, it crumbles.
Correct. It physically collapses.
Right.
And when it collapses, the entire architecture of the wrist joint collapses with it, leading to incredibly severe, crippling arthritis.
And the really scary part the guide mentions. Scaphoid fractures are notoriously hard to see. They are often completely invisible on initial x-rays.
They hide very well.
Yeah, so someone falls, their wrist hurts, and they just think they sprained their thumb.
Exactly. They ignore it. They think, oh, it's just a bad sprain, I'll put some ice on it. And by the time it finally shows up clearly on an x-ray a few weeks later, the bone fragment is already dying.
That is wild.
That is exactly why if a patient comes in with tenderness, specifically in that little anatomical snuff box, doctors treat it as a fracture until firmly proven otherwise. You put it in a cast, even if the initial x-ray looks perfectly clean.
Better safe than sorry when the bone might literally die.
Absolutely.
Now there's one other carpal bone that got a major spotlight in the text. The lunate.
The moon-shaped bone. It sits right in the middle.
Yeah,
It's dangerous, but for a totally different reason.
Yeah.
If you dislocate the lunate, usually from a really hard fall, it tends to pop forward out of its spot.
And what is sitting directly in front of it?
The carpal tunnel.
Ah. Carpal tunnel syndrome. Now, we usually think of that as a repetitive strain issue, right? Like typing too much on a keyboard.
Right, but the carpal tunnel isn't just a concept. It's an actual physical space in your wrist. It is a narrow, rigid hallway with a hard floor made of carpal bones and a thick roof made of ligament.
And it is packed full of important stuff.
It is incredibly crowded in there. Packed inside that tiny tunnel are 9 separate flexor tendons and the very sensitive median nerve.
So there is zero room for error.
None. So if that lunate bone dislocates and physically invades that tight tunnel space, it instantly crushes the median nerve against the ligament roof.
So in that case, it's not a slow, chronic ache from typing. It's an acute, severe medical emergency.
Exactly. You lose sensation and muscle control in your hand almost immediately.
Okay, before we completely wrap up this anatomical journey, the guide touched on a couple of really interesting failure points in the hand that aren't actually about bones breaking. It's about the soft tissue rigging failing.
Right, the non-bony structures.
Yeah. Specifically, I want to talk about Dupuytren's contracture and trigger finger.
These are fascinating conditions because they really show how the delicate gliding mechanisms of the hand can just naturally gun up over time. Let's start with Dupuytren's. It's a genetic condition where the fascia, which is this tough sheet of tissue sitting right under the skin of your palm, begins to thicken and heavily scar.
It creates these visible cords in the hand, doesn't it?
Yes, thick, ropey, fibrous cords. And as they develop, they slowly contract. Over months and years, it physically pulls the ring finger and the pinky finger down, curled into the palm.
Wow, can the person just straighten them out?
They can't. You cannot put your hand flat on a table anymore. It's not usually painful, which is strange, but it is massively functionally limiting. It looks like the hand is slowly closing in on itself permanently.
And what about trigger finger? That one sounded much more mechanical in nature.
It is purely mechanical. To bend your fingers, your flexor tendons have to glide smoothly through these tiny little tunnels or fibrous sheaths in your fingers. The sheaths keep the tendon tight against the bone.
Like a fishing line running through the eyelets on a fishing rod.
Exactly. Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Now, if the tendon gets irritated and inflamed, it can form a small nodule, a little swollen lump.
And that lump acts like a knot in a rope trying to pull through a small pulley.
Right. It literally can't fit through the tunnel entrance easily, so it gets stuck. You try to straighten your bent finger, and it physically locks in place.
And then what? You force it.
Then you push a little harder, and the tension builds until snap. The nodule forcefully squeezes its way through the tight constriction. It literally triggers open.
The human body really is just a complex machine with incredibly tight tolerances.
It's incredibly tight. A single millimeter of swelling here, a tiny degree of misaligned rotation there, and the entire systemic function changes dramatically.
So we have traced the entire line today. We started way up at the clavicle, this fragile strut that willingly snaps to save the shoulder joint from exploding.
We traveled down the humerus, the nerve highway, where breaking the bone means risking slicing the wiring.
We saw how the elbow's perfect geometry can pinpoint a break, and how the wrist's bizarre retrograde blood supply can quietly destroy a bone from the inside out.
And honestly, the biggest takeaway for me from reading all these sources is that every single upper limb injury tells a profound story about function and evolution.
How so?
Well, we break our clavicle so often because it alone bears the heavy load of our arms. We dislocate our shoulders so easily because we explicitly evolve for incredible reach and overhead throwing. We get severe carpal tunnel issues because we are constantly trying to send massive amounts of sensory and motor data via that median nerve through a tiny, crowded, bony arch.
It is truly brilliant engineering, but it is definitely very high maintenance engineering.
It demands respect. You have to respect the machinery.
I want to leave you, the listener, with one final thought from the very beginning of the source material that really stuck with me. It briefly mentioned that the clavicle, that vital strut we rely on so heavily, isn't actually present in all mammals.
That's right. It's quite rare in certain animals. Dogs, horses, cows, they don't have a functional collarbone. They might have a tiny vestigial remnant floating in the muscle, but no solid structural bone bridging the gap.
Which makes perfect sense when you think about it. Lacking that bone allows them to absorb the massive repetitive impact of running on their front legs much better than we ever could. Their shoulders essentially float completely free, acting like giant shock absorbers.
Exactly.
But because they lack that strut pushing the joint outward, it also means a horse or a dog cannot throw a baseball, they can't reach their arm out to the side to hug someone. Evolution forced a choice. We traded that rugged durability for fine-tuned dexterity.
We traded shock absorption for the unparalleled ability to reach out and manipulate the world around us.
So the next time you happen to trip over a rug and you instinctively throw your hands out to catch yourself, just remember, in that split second, you are actively testing millions of years of evolutionary compromises.
And hopefully your clavicle holds up to the test.
Let's hope so. Thanks for diving deep into the anatomy with us today. We will catch you on the next one.